For my final project, I'm currently looking at concentrating on British seaside resorts off-season. My previous projects have all involved the idea of liminality, of places that are stuck between two worlds. When the course started, I was living in the United Arab Emirates, and my initial idea was to look at a different facet of life in the Middle East for each unit, with the final project being a book containing all of these. I first looked at the UAE as a liminal place in terms of a collision of the past and present, of traditional Arab lifestyles and the ultra-modernity of the new cities growing out of the desert. I then moved on to look at borders in the Middle East, places where territorial wars had once been fought, but now are practically invisible unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Partway through this unit, I decided that I would be relocating to the UK at the end of that academic year. Thus I widened my brief to look at liminal zones between countries in more general. My last unit concentrated again on the idea of borders, this time looking at how the internal borders of the British Isles presented themselves, especially at the differences between borders more rooted in history, such as the Welsh and Scottish borders, as compared to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I felt that this was particularly apt, considering the massive uncertainty facing the latter border in light of the upcoming Brexit and the problems it would bring. Although my initial idea was to carry this into my final project, I felt that there was not a great deal more I could add at this stage. I also felt that the Irish border as a photographic subject was already being pretty thoroughly explored, and this would almost certainly continue in the upcoming months. So I decided I might like to try something else, still involving the idea of liminality. Despite the fact that I spent the last 9 years living less than a mile from some of the greatest beaches in the UAE, I have never been much of a beach person. However, one of the things I found that I missed about the UK was seaside resorts, particularly off-season. The melancholic air of faded grandeur fitted neatly into my sense of hiraeth, a Welsh word meaning a nostalgic longing and homesickness, much along the lines of the Portuguese idea of saudade and the Japanese concept of mono no aware and the attendant aesthetic of wabi-sabi. In terms of liminality, this would fit well with what I wish to explore. British seaside resorts off-season are liminal between land and water, past and present, summer and winter. Also, historically, the heyday of British resorts was brought to an end by cheap foreign travel. In the light of upcoming Brexit, there's a chance that this itself may come to an end. So with much talk of a return to the great British past, something to which I've never really subscribed, I thought I'd like to see how this manifests itself. I asked friends both online and in person what the Great British Seaside meant to them. I deliberately did not mention the idea of off-season resorts, as I was hoping for childhood experiences that I could examine as to whether any vestige still existed. I also got hold of all the books set in British seaside resorts I could find, and naturally had a good look at what has gone before. Martin Parr is one of the reasons I got back into photography, so naturally The Last Resort was top of my list, which led on to Ken Grant and Tom Wood. I found that I had just missed an exhibition of all three in New Brighton, which was extremely disappointing. But New Brighton, about a 90-minute drive from where I lived, seemed to be a natural part to start looking. I found that the town was considerably more genteel than Parr's photograph suggested, though I suspect this was a combination of it being September rather than July, and 35 years after The Last Resort. However, it did make me realise that to get the full range of seaside experiences, I would need to visit a lot more resorts. My paternal family are from Pwllheli, and I have lived in or near Felixstowe, Morecambe and Exmouth in the past, all four very different experiences. I also decided that my project, in keeping with my previous projects, would be less about people and more about place, and the way that the ideas that I'm looking at manifest themselves in the physical infrastructure of the place. Two weeks later, I was due to visit friends in Somerset for an experimental electronic music festival. This meant that I could get to visit Minehead and Burnham-on-Sea, Breen and Weston-super-Mare whilst in the area. Again, each differing a fair amount from the rest. This made me realise that what I initially had thought of as being a single subject was more likely to be a lot more broad and nuanced than I had originally planned. For example, in Minehead, there is a huge Butlins camp, which in the summer is home to a great many tourists, but off-season is given over to music weekends. Thus, the population of Minehead on a weekend in off-season is very different from that during the summer. Breen, for example, I also found was home to mostly caravan parks, and it was very difficult to actually get onto the beach. Furthermore, the Experimental Electronic Music Festival, along with the Week 1 and 2 case studies, gave me the idea of moving into a more multimedia sphere. Initially, my idea had been of a book combining photographs and text. Now I'm considering looking at how I could possibly use ambient field recordings of seaside towns, background video, and possibly mixes of nostalgic music as a counterpoint to the faded and often uglier reality of empty buildings, economic failure, and social deprivation faced by many of these places. At the moment, I'm exploring the possibility of presenting this as an exhibition, an online multimedia experience, or a combination of the two. If this does not work out, my backup plan is to extend the idea of internal borders either to Celtic borders, taking into account the borders of Cornwall and Brittany, or to borders between the ancient kingdoms that once made up Britain, and what, if anything, remains of them.